Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Please take a moment to click the like button, that little thumb guy, if you would, and also please subscribe if you haven't already subscribed to our channel. We'd love to have your subscription. And if you'd like to get notifications about upcoming episodes, please click the bell icon.
So each week, my friend Todd and I will be talking about the lectionary reading from the Gospels for the upcoming weekend. And we're going to be talking about those gospel readings in the context of love and inclusion and societal justice. Our goal is that our talking will be just, as in justice, that will be concerned with justice. But then also something we might say during our brief conversation might inspire you alongside with us to do more in our daily walk than just talking. So, Todd, what passage are we looking at this week?
So we are in Matthew chapter 20, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 16, one of Jesus' parables.
Yeah, this is the parable where the guys who came for the last hour of the workday got paid the same amount as the people who had been there all day long. All right.
Yeah.
So the
So,
first time I was introduced to this parable, well, an alternate interpretation of this parable, I should say. I mean, I grew up hearing all kinds of interpretations of these parables in churches of this parable. But was John Ruskin's work, Unto the Last, which was written in 1860. And the way I stumbled upon that is through Mahatma Gandhi's works. Gandhi had been deeply influenced by the economics of Ruskin, who based his economics on this parable. And actually, in Gandhi's press, at his printing press, um, the way that he applied it was that everybody, all the workers, whether they were a janitor or in charge of the press or like even the CEO, they didn't call it that, but that position, a manager, they all got paid the same per hour. They
mhm.
all got paid the same hourly wage. Everyone was invested in the success of the endeavor, and the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And this parable is not like a reversal where the last are treated like the first and the first are treated like the last. It's that they're all the same. They're all treated equally. That's what Ruskin was talking of unto the last. So I mean that's the economic interpretation, and I favor that one. Of course, there's the religious interpretation that says Jesus was really just talking about deathbed conversions.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
and there's colonialism. Colonialism uses this parable to talk about countries that come into Christianity later than others, late in the history of Christianity, that those countries will be, in the great beyond, in the hereafter, treated the same as those. So there's kind of a corporateness within colonialism, but there's also an individualism with a deathbed conversions way of interpreting
Mhm.
this parable. But again, both of those are not very convincing. If Jesus is standing in the Hebrew prophetic tradition of justice, and which I believe he was, all of the Hebrew prophets called for justice. And I can't help but think that Jesus' original audience would have heard this in some spiritualized way. They would have heard it in a very economic way. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is if I've never heard this parable preached according to what Ruskin wrote and what Gandhi did with it. I've never. It's always been uh, you get salvation whether you choose to follow Jesus at the beginning
At
of
the
your
11th
life, at the
hour,
middle of your life, or at the
right?
last day of your life. That's what this parable has always meant. It's what everybody does with it, and uh, and so again, this parable is really, it boils down to, are you going to interpret it through that Gnostic spiritualistic lens that most of Christianity does, or are you going to actually read it, dare I say, more literally, and take it as an actual economic teaching? And it's actually it's economic philosophy 101, for what Jesus is trying to communicate, and what prophets before Jesus and prophets after Jesus have preached. It is, and it just boils down to what interpretive framework are you going to use to go with it, and because this clearly is an economic teaching if you take it literally.
Mhm. And I would say that yes, the majority of Christians of imperial Christians, capitalist Christians,
Mm-hmm.
interpret this the religious way, the spiritual way. But
Yeah.
when we crack the books on liberation theology and
Right.
liberation theologians, they side with Ruskin. They side with those who interpret it economically. And
Yeah.
honestly, it's pretty convincing. I have some passages here from the Hebrew prophetic tradition. Um, Isaiah 117. I mean, my point in sharing these is just listen. I got about four of them. Listen to these and then go back and read this parable in the context of these statements from the
Mm.
prophets. And all of a sudden, you see Jesus isn't preaching some Christian theology. He's standing in this Jewish Hebrew prophetic justice tradition. So Isaiah 117 says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the cause of the widow. And Jeremiah 5:28, it says, they have grown fat and sleek. Their evil deeds have no limit. They do not seek justice. They do not promote the case of the fatherless. They do not defend the cause of the poor. In Amos 2 and Amos 5, they trample the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground. They deny justice to the oppressed, but let justice roll on like a river and righteousness like a never failing stream. And then lastly, Micah 3, verse 1. Then I said, listen, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of Israel, should you not embrace justice? So again, the Hebrew prophets weren't about getting people into heaven. The
Right.
Hebrew prophets were about challenging the injustices they saw in their society. For them, poverty or exploitation, those were societal sins
Yeah.
of the system or the elite. Like
Yeah.
poverty was a sin, not that poor people were guilty of. The
Mm-hmm.
elites and the people in charge of society who were benefiting, they were guilty
Yeah.
of creating a system that put some people, created poverty for some people. And so they were calling out against those things. And then Jesus steps into that tradition and says, let me tell you a parable about these workers and what the kingdom could look like if we practiced these principles. So for me, when I read it, it makes way more consistent sense
Right.
to read it in the context of economic justice.
Right. I mean, even those Old Testament prophets, they would they would pronounce again, they would pronounce judgments from God upon their people, and would interpret enemies attacking them as God's punishment, not for not believing in the coming of the Messiah or believing in an afterlife, but for these injustices being done. They saw the great cataclysmic events of Jewish history being related to Israel and Judah not keeping faith on justice. That's where everything landed, was whether or not the nation was being just. And so it makes perfect sense that Jesus would be following that same tradition.
Yeah, if we see Jesus as just a religious preacher or a spiritual guru who goes around trying to get people to say a sinner's prayer so that he can give them a ticket to heaven, then interpreting this parable economically doesn't make sense at all. It makes more sense to interpret it the other way. But if Jesus is giving birth to a Jewish renewal movement where he's calling people back to both the portions of the prophets and the Torah, the law and the prophets that emphasize societal justice. And he says, that's what faithfulness to the God of the Torah looks like when you practice like Deuteronomy 15, when debts are forgiven and poverty is eradicated from your society. um then we look at this parable with a whole new set of lenses to say, what is Jesus talking about? He's calling people back to the economic values and ethics that are in the Torah that would eliminate poverty from their society. And honestly, that's the first ethic that we bump into in this parable is the objection of the workers who had been there all day. They said, when you pay them the same thing you're paying us, and they agreed to a day's wages when they signed up for that in the morning. But
Right.
their complaint is, when you give those people also a day's wages who haven't been here all day, you're making them equal with us. And so equality is the first ethic that we bump into in this parable. It's the first thing that's introduced, that it's offensive to those who have worked really hard and feel like they've earned everything. They look at equality as a violation to them when it's just given to someone else. And boy, does that not echo in today's society.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that I'm learning right now is just how, in my new job, since I've left pastoring a church and now I'm in a hospital chaplain, is learning how the hospital runs. And one of the things that I'm already seeing is, you see the environmental care staff, the ones who empty the trash, who clean the rooms, who sterilize equipment and things like that. They are paid at the lowest level in the hospital, and yet if the hospital is not clean,
right,
the hospital ceases to function. It cannot function effectively if it's not clean. And yet these workers, because they don't have a college degree or a postdoc degree or a medical degree, they get paid so much less than other people who work in the hospital, and yet their job is so crucial to the organization that if you were to, that it would be right, it would be just that those environmental care workers would get paid the same as someone who's a physical therapist or somebody who's an RN.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, but the reason is because not because they have the same degrees, but because their needs are the same. Every human being has the same needs.
Right. And to act like, well, if that's the case, and a person who cleans the rooms gets paid as much as physical therapists and RNs, who would go on to do schooling to do physical therapy and RNs? A lot of people would.
Because they would want to. Yes, right. And you would know they were physical therapists because they loved the job, not the money.
That's right. That's exactly right. You would get people doing what they loved.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there wouldn't be people being neglected. And all these environmental care workers are doing an 8-hour or 10-hour shift at this hospital, and they're turning around and going up the street to the other hospital to do another 8-hour, 10-hour shift in order to make enough money to provide for their needs.
And they have the same needs as other people.
Yep.
Yeah. So again, for those that are, I hear in my head, I know there are people watching this that are just screaming amen. And then there are other people I'm sure have neurons exploding in their head right now as they're listening to this. But for those people who are struggling, this theme, or this ethic of equality, which is the first value that we bump into in this parable, that we're challenged by, is a theme within the justice tradition of the scriptures. In Exodus 16, with the manna, it says, this is what the Lord commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Okay. Take an omer for each person that you have in your tent. So you're supposed to take an omer, however it was collected, you're supposed to divide it up by an omer per person. There's equality there. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some gathered little. They went out and they didn't all gather the same amount, but when it was all pulled together, it says when they measured it by the omer, the one who had gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. So again, there's that equality where it was pulled together and, divided up equally. In 2 Corinthians 8:13, it says, our desire, this is Paul of all people, the desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn, their plenty will supply what you need. The goal is equality. And that's a New Testament passage. I don't know why we don't take that passage literally. Yeah. But the last one is in Acts 4, where those who had a lot didn't consider it their own. They gave it to the apostle. They sold it, gave the money to the apostles. It was divided up among the people who had needs. Yep. And it says in Acts 4:34 that as a result of this, there was no needy person among you. They were following the ethics and principles of the Torah. And just like the Torah promised that if you do this, you will not have the poor among you, the early followers of Jesus sought to apply this. And in those communities that did, the Torah rang true. There was no needy person among them.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, and for those who say, but Jesus says the poor will always be with you. Well, yeah, because it was a condemnation.
It was a condemnation.
In the same way, it's in the same way Deuteronomy says you'll never have the poor with you if you do these things. Jesus says because you're rejecting these things, you'll always have the poor with you.
Yeah.
So again, the first principle is equality, which drives people in our system. Well, I shouldn't say all people, but certain people. It certainly drives certain people in our present system crazy to hear any talk of equality economically.
Because it's a fundamentally different morality that's being applied. And it's saying that you should have worked things out from when you were in high school. You should have been on the right track, and you should have, and I've heard the blame against, well, it's the single parent home. So because the single parent home, the child didn't get the same support, therefore they grew up, and so they're not going to get the same. But it's still a fundamental moral problem of the single parent or the child who didn't do what they were supposed to do. And so, and again, people will will bend over every which way to make poverty
the fault of the poor.
The fault of the poor, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I can't help but think, again, this principle, wherever you bump into it, of course, in the parable, people who got paid for working a whole day and saw other people getting paid the same got upset because those people didn't work as hard for it as they did. I can't imagine with the manna. I mean, what if I gathered a ton? Why don't I get to take what I worked for this morning back to my tent? Why do I have to divide it up equally among everybody? I worked hard for this.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead and try that. It's going to breed worms and stink and rot. And, you know what I mean?
Yep.
So again, this is, and yeah, my point is that it is just as challenging today, I'm sure, as it was originally. But again, when you take this parable economically rather than spiritually, all of a sudden the knife cuts really close to home. And maybe that's why we don't like this way of interpreting it.
No,
there are a lot of us among us who say, listen, I have what I have because I worked hard for it.
Right.
Well, it's not exactly that simple.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
So the second thing we bump into is generosity. His response to them saying, you're making them equal to us, is not to say, no, I'm not. His response is, "Are you envious? Because I am generous."
Mm,
So I mean, are we out to just pay people according to how much they work, which we don't do, by the way?
no.
Those who own the business exploit the value of people's labor all the time. But
Right.
nonetheless, it's a different discussion. Our system today isn't based on generosity, it's based on what you earn. It's not a spirit of sharing. It's how much can I amass.
Right.
Today we have a few people on this planet that have more than the rest of the population combined, and those few people have more than they could possibly ever need. While there are people who are just scraping out of existence, whose needs will never be met.
Yeah.
I have a quote, Todd, from Gustavo Gutierrez on this. I forgot to tell you about this ahead of time. I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to share my screen. I'm going to try to bring this up really quick. Sorry for all the watchers. I promise I'll get my technological act together between now and next week. Let's try this and see what happens. Can you see that, Todd?
I can see. Yes, I can see it.
All right. So it says the poor person does not exist as an inescapable fact of destiny. His or her existence is not politically neutral and it is not ethically innocent. The poor are a byproduct of the system in which we live and for which we are responsible. They are marginalized by our social and cultural world. They are the oppressed, exploited proletariat, robbed of the fruit of their labor and despoiled of their humanity. Hence, the poverty of the poor is not a call to a generous relief action like charity, but a demand that we go and build a different social order,
Mm,
a system in which charity becomes obsolete. We no longer need it. And that's The Power of the Poor in History, again, by Gustavo Gutierrez. Such a great statement. Such a
yeah.
great statement. I mean,
Yeah.
it's based on generosity. We create a system based on generosity where we want to make sure everybody's taken care of rather than how many hours did you work today?
Right. Yeah. There. I- It's just a full. I mean, to get our heads around this and to get the heads of those who lead corporations and the heads of those who lead our governments to get our heads around what it would be like to actually think generously towards the poor as economic development
Wow. Wow.
and see that as because everybody will say that across the board homelessness and poverty has such a deleterious effect upon the economy and upon social
Poverty costs
institutions.
us more than welfare does.
Poverty costs so much to those of us who have more. We
Mm-hmm.
pay so much just to to manage the
Yes.
problems that
Yes.
exist because of poverty.
It
That
would be
if
cheaper
we
to eliminate poverty.
it would be cheaper to eliminate poverty. And so you wouldn't even have to get people to the place of saying, I'm thinking generously. If you could just get people to think
Right.
selfishly and the
Right.
selfishness based upon the common good, that we could actually get to a place
That's a good point.
um,
Maybe
of
generosity is too high a goal right
too
now.
high a
Maybe
goal.
maybe we just start small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just because I don't want to have to, hospitals, we don't want to have to write off all these expenses of the ER because we keep having homeless people come into our ER for treatment because they can't take care of themselves on the street. And so
Mm.
we're tired of paying all this money and writing off all these expenses. So because of that, we're gonna start lobbying Congress to change how we handle our homeless problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I like it. I like it. So the last ethic that we bump into in this parable is the foundation for the first two. We talked about equality, we talked about generosity, but at the end, this is the principle that really gives birth to the other two ethics, the other two values, and that is a concern for workers' needs. The landowner is certainly profiting off of the work of these laborers,
Mhm.
but his goal is not to squeeze as much labor out of them as he can for as little payment as possible or as much profit out of them as he possibly can. He's not concerned with how many hours they worked. That point is clear in the parable. What he's
Right.
concerned with is using his land to provide for the needs of as many as his land could possibly provide for. He's
Mhm.
concerned with the workers' needs because whether they work for an hour or whether they worked all day, each one of those workers still has the same needs. They have people back home that are depending on them, maybe spouses, maybe children, you know what I mean? They have the
Mhm.
same daily needs in that society, regardless of whether they were hired at the end of the day or whether they were hired at the beginning. The people that were hired at the beginning, how fortunate, how lucky for them. The other people stood there all day, and when they were asked, "Why haven't you, come work?" And he said, "Well, nobody hired us."
Mhm.
Today until now, and he's moved with compassion for these people who have stood there all day waiting for someone to hire them, and he says, "Come work for me," even though there's only an hour left. And what he ends up doing is saying, "You know what? They have the same needs as everyone else. I'm just going to
Yep.
pay them for a full day's wages too."
Yep.
That's again equality, that's generosity,
Yep.
but it's both of those are rooted in a primary concern for the needs of the workers themselves. I think about the writer's strike in Southern California right now. I think about the
Mhm.
auto workers strike that's just
Mhm.
beginning and our country. Concern for the workers' needs. The economy always does better. And here's some of that selfish motivation. If
If that's what only people
yeah,
can go for.
if we can't go to generosity and equality, maybe we just go selfish for a minute and say your economy is going to do better when
Right.
the needs of the workers are being met.
Right. Right.
They're going to spend that money. Somebody's going to be profiting somewhere.
Yep. Well, I mean, and this is why one of the major problems of the way our economy is structured now is so many of our corporations are owned by shareholders. And so the it's interesting, those who run these corporations do have an interest in somebody's welfare. They're
Mhm.
concerned about shareholders getting more money so that the shareholders are happy with them and will vote to keep them in power.
Yeah.
Um, and and what so it, there's a fundamental concern that the rich keep getting richer.
Yeah.
So there is that concern. That
That's
that
the
is what the
primary
concern
motive.
is.
That's the
That is the
primary
primary
concern.
motive.
Not
And so
the needs of the workers,
not the needs of the workers,
the
and what we've
profiting of the shareholders. That's what our system's based for.
that's right. And instead you could build the same you could build an economic system where it was based upon your workers getting what they needed, and and being taken care of the way they needed to be taken care of, and you could still have profitable businesses in a whole other way. But
Yeah.
because it has been the primary concern is that you help rich people get richer. That's how we are fundamentally set up.
Mm-hmm. And
And
and there are
so
ways we could do it. I mean, I know in some states, I live in Appalachia, I live here in West Virginia, and our minimum wage here is not a living wage. It's just
right.
not. People can't afford housing and food and transportation and and clothing. They can't afford all of that based on minimum wage. But
Right.
there are cities out there. I think of Seattle who
Mhm.
penalizes companies if there's too great of a distance between your highest paid employee and your lowest paid employee. If
Mhm.
that difference is too great, and we have examples of CEOs who have taken cuts in salary to bring everybody up to what was the guy? Oh man, I should have
Yeah, I
done
know
more
who you're
research for
talking
this.
about. Yeah.
But you remember him coming out on Twitter and everybody said his company's going to bomb, and then all of a
Right.
sudden it's successful.
Yeah.
I mean, there are ways to do it. And I know some people say, well, those who don't work don't eat. That's a New Testament saying. And again, I agree with that, but shareholders are not working and they sure are eating. You know what I
Yep.
mean? Rarely do I hear that phrase applied to the wealthy, those who gain their income from passive income. I mean, passive income means I don't work for it. I just get
Right.
it. You know
Right.
what I mean? And some people will object and say, well, if you have this kind of system that you're talking about, people will take advantage of it. Well, of course they will, but people take advantage of our present system too. There's all kinds of tax loopholes that the wealthy
Absolutely.
take advantage of. And people say, well,
Absolutely.
some people are lazy, but there's lazy people in all classes.
Yes.
There's wealthy, lazy people as well as there's lazy, poor people.
Right.
Laziness doesn't dictate necessarily how much you earn in our world today. I know plenty of wealthy people who are lazy as all get out, and yet they
Right.
still make money hand over fist.
Yep. Yeah.
Can you tell
There.
this is a soapbox? I don't mean to get so excited, Todd.
How dare you, Herb? How dare
It's
you
just
get
lighting
so
it's
excited
like
about
lighting a fire. It's like lighting
it?
a
I know.
gasoline. Boom.
I know. It's just, and we're two guys talking to about 50 or 60 people a week, and
Right.
we're just, you know, having during our little tempest in a teapot. But this is fundamentally, we're doing this stupid little show because we still believe that if anybody would pay attention to what Jesus was trying to do, and if anybody still says, you know what, Jesus is valuable, Jesus matters, Jesus is worth listening to, we're here to tell you absolutely he is.
Yeah, this
There's
stuff has the potential to change our world,
This is
not
damn good
making
stuff.
everybody evangelical. I don't mean that.
No, it's a if you
But it
look
can
at,
turn the
but
world upside down
absolutely could.
for poor people.
It absolutely could. It could make this world a much more just and equitable place for everybody.
That's
And,
right.
uh, so yeah, it's, you can get tired of beating the drum, but it's such good stuff. It's such good stuff. What
If
Jesus
we
is
take this
teaching.
parable and say it's not about everybody getting to the same heaven no matter when they accept salvation, and we look at the principles of equality, generosity, and concern for workers' needs, man, it
Yeah,
just strikes so close to home in our
yeah,
real world application. I cannot help, once you look at it this way, but believe this is the way Jesus originally intended it. He wasn't talking about tickets to heaven, he was talking
no,
about a place where the poor that he saw being exploited in his own society were taken care of.
yeah, yeah. Uh,
Well,
what else you got, Herb? You got
that
more
that's it.
stuff
I'm
to get on
out.
a
I'm
soapbox?
out.
No, 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 more soapbox. We
No,
want
no,
more
I'm out. I've
soapbox,
already
Herb.
screamed enough tonight.
Come on, come on.
That's it. That's all I got, Todd.
All right, fine. Guess we'll have to wait till next week to get a little bit more. Um, I don't know what next week is. I haven't looked ahead, so I don't. We'll see if it's good soapbox material or it's one of those that.
I
Yeah.
know that I was working on 2 weeks from now today.
Mm-hmm.
And man, no, October 6th, the week of October 6th. I think October 6th is the Friday that week. That week is some good stuff. The week
Okay.
leading up to October 6th, 7, and 8, that weekend, the week
Mm-hmm.
before that, tune into this show because that's another soapbox week.
Nice, nice. All right.
I forget what next week is.
Well, I guess I'll keep showing up.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks for your vote of confidence. And for those that are offended tonight, those of you out there who hear this and your economic sensibilities are highly offended, please keep tuning in. Please keep coming back.
Yeah. This is yeah, at the end of the day, if it's Jesus. This is if you care about Jesus, you want to know what he's saying.
Yeah,
So
and Jesus talked about economics more than any other topic.
yeah.
Because I love what Emily Townsend said. Dr. Emily Townsend, if you start with the idea that God loves everyone, justice isn't very far behind.
Right. Yep.
Jesus was concerned about the economics of the poor because he believed God loved them too.
Yeah. And love
All
is
right, man.
expressed in justice.
That's right. That's right.
All right,
So where
Herb.
can we
So
find you, Todd?
you can find me at toddjleonard.com. And I'm still not doing really good at I'm still got to get into the flow of updating my website more often. So if you go to my website right now, you're not seeing the current stuff. You're seeing stuff from a little while back. But I'm working on making that a regular place for me to post stuff again. So toddjleonard.com, and hope to see new stuff soon. How about you,
And
Herb?
I
Where
don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but tune in next week because we might have a special surprise for you.
Ooh.
Ooh. So you can find me at Herbert. No, that was my email address I was about to give to you. You can find me at renewedheartministries.com and everywhere that leads you to past that. I think that's good. I'm on Facebook and all that stuff, but just go to our website. You'll find us, renewedheartministries.com. And that's what I got.
What's your home address and social security
Yeah,
number?
right. So as much as just rattle it all off. Here you go, YouTube.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks for watching. We enjoyed being with you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
All right. Thanks for watching, everyone.